Which of the contenders atop the ACC is just going to flounder this year?
You are Locked On ACC, your daily podcast on the Atlantic Coast Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you so much for making Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. Shout out to the everydayers. We love you. We are available free wherever you get your podcasts. We're free on YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On this episode, we'll talk about a very interesting prediction on what the 10 most watched college football games are going to be this upcoming season. We'll talk fall camp reports within the Atlantic Coast Conference. But first, Kenton Gibbs, if I were to, and I fear, one of the teams that you may respond with, but if I were to ask you, which of the contending teams atop the ACC, at least the preseason contenders, do you think is just going to let everyone down, fall flat on their faces this year? Who would that be in your opinion?
Donno, I hate to have to do this to you.
Why are you doing this?
You're my guy. You know you're my guy. But I've got to avoid you Miami Hurricanes for another team that wears orange. Yes! The Clemson Tigers. I'm concerned. And here's the thing, right? I'm not saying this. Of course, we talked about Donno and the Miami Hurricanes and their problems ad nauseum. We've talked about their coaching deficiencies. We've talked about the fact that secondary is extremely young and unproven in a ton of places, especially behind the few starters that they have that's played good football. And we've talked a lot about Clemson and the good things that they have in terms of a secondary that looked better and better as last year went on. But there are some problems with that team that we have not really gotten into meaningfully. We believe that their D-line the young guys who played a little bit last year are all of a sudden going to step in and, well, it's a Clemson defensive lineman. They'll get it figured out. We believe that the defensive tackle that they had last year that was doing great things in terms of, I can't remember the name right now, but North Carolina native, Central North Carolina to be specific, who did great things towards the end of last year, is going to continue to do that. We believe that Brown and Williams offensively are going to take next steps as receivers to carry this thing, and we believe that Mafia and company will take next steps, which all of it makes sense. All of it checks out, but who believes in that offensive line right now? Who would say I'm comfortable believing in that offensive line? You combine that with a quarterback who has faulty decision-making, to say the least. Right. To say the least. You combine that with Barrett Carter coming back, absolutely amazing. Absolutely, he's a phenomenal linebacker. He's a freak of nature. I cannot talk enough about the type of athlete I think he is. I was extremely concerned last year when after game one they said, hey, we're concerned about our conditioning after game one. And then this year you start off game one with Georgia. That's the type of game one that can break a program. And I mean that very genuinely. We saw it with Florida State a few years ago. And I'm hoping that we don't see the same thing again this year. But I am telling you, watch out for those Tigers. Things could get ugly if, number one, they don't keep that Georgia game close. Number two, they don't find a way to rebound if that game does get ugly. And number three, those defensive linemen, those young defensive linemen have to take a step forward. But if not, if those three things, at least two of those three don't happen, it's going to be a long year in Death Valley.
I co-sign with you on Clemson being the choice, but let me throw in another option here, because when we're talking about expectations versus possible realities, how can I not throw Florida State into that mix, Kenton? And I say it for the simple reason of Florida State University, they are such a consensus choice as the team that's going to repeat and win the ACC again, which is interesting. Like pretty much like any reputable publication has predicted Florida State, they're going to repeat as ACC champions, get into the college football playoff. And I get it, well-coached team, and they were just there last year, but are we just going to pretend that it's a rinse and repeat situation after losing 10 players drafted to the NFL last year, led the ACC, But now I know that obviously shows that you coached them up and you picked some great transfers and all that. But at the same time, are we just going to pretend that they're going to rinse and repeat after losing players like Jordan Travis and Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson, losing your top running back from last year, losing Braden Fiske and Jared Verse? Like, we're just going to pretend that everything's going to be exactly the same going from that. So I bring them up only because when the expectation is so high, there's really only two things that can happen. Either you meet the expectation, you can't really exceed the expectations. Either you meet them or you fall short. I can understand if you were returning your quarterback and you were returning your top two receivers from last year, they're having to replace so many of these guys, Kenton. So I look at that and say, okay, everybody's picking them to win the ACC again this year. I think other teams have closed that gap at least a little bit.
And I'll tell you what, that is a very fair assertion in terms of what you're looking at and how you're saying, hey, this team is definitely one to be looked at in terms of the expectation. But I kind of struggle with this in terms of some of the teams that we didn't pick as the picks. One thing that I want to make clear is these are not definitive statements with us saying this is who we know, because every team at the top has very big question marks. Every single team at the top. There's a reason that Donno and I are saying this is the most wide open the ACC has been in probably over a decade, because this isn't a two-team race. There are multiple horses that can come away with this, and nobody would say, oh, it's the shock of the century. We couldn't have predicted. Nobody could have seen this coming. If you look at the ACC at the end of the year and Louisville is the champion, would you be surprised?
No, I wouldn't. I'd be mildly surprised, but I wouldn't say like, I can't. It's Leicester City winning the EPL. Nothing like that.
And they were the only team in the top six that did not get a single vote to win it. Yeah. So with that being said, we know that I picked NC State. I wouldn't be surprised if NC State won it. Most of the nation wouldn't be surprised if NC State won it, based on the fact that, again, they have a lot coming back or they not have a lot coming back. They have a lot coming in terms of utilizing the transfer portal and whatnot. Miami, exact same deal to an intensified degree.
Yeah.
The way that Miami utilized the portal, a lot of people would say, hey, that's a team to watch out for. And, of course, you have the incumbents with Florida State and Clemson and all that good stuff, guys that you think of every time at the top of this thing. So Donno and I, don't take this as me and Donno saying, we know for a fact these teams are going to flounder. We're just saying these are the two teams with the highest likelihood of floundering, especially against expectations. Because even if NC State did flop, people would say, oh, it's NC State being NC State. It's the same old NC State. If Miami did flop, people would say, Miami preseason champs, once again, got them 7 wins, once again. But Clemson and Florida State, I promise you, is not lawsuit related at all. We are looking at these two teams and saying, you all are perched at the top. But when you are the highest up, you have the furthest to fall. And that is very much so a possibility because, again, Tyler Davis, take it all the way back to Daquan Bowers, Dexter Lawrence. They're not walking through that door. Neither is Jordan Travis or Keon Coleman or Jameis Winston or any of those guys.
And that's my main point, is that Florida State especially, and Clemson second in that regard, they're getting a benefit of the doubt that, and listen, I've covered Miami for like 2 decades. I get it. Like I get the whole falling short of expectations, whether it be preseason champs or offseason champs. If Miami were to fall short this year, I don't know how many people would be shocked by that. That just comes with the territory for Miami, where, if Florida State, who lost so many important players from last year to that team that went, 13-0 and won the ACC championship and should have gotten into the playoff, God forbid they fall short this year. I think there's going to be a lot more surprise folks out there, but we got a lot more to come on this episode of Locked On ACC. Fall camps are rolling on. In fact, you've got the aforementioned Florida State and Georgia Tech. They're playing a game at the end of this week in Ireland. I see, Florida State folks that I follow, they're already over there drinking pints in the pubs over there in Dublin. They're ready. They're ready for game day. You guys want to keep it locked right here. We're only getting started on this brand new episode of Locked On ACC. And I'm only getting started with FanDuel. Guys, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, and there's good reason for that. They're America's #1 sports book. Well, we have something a little different for you. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. That's a deal. Then, with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. And by the way, while you're there on FanDuel, you could also be placing wagers on who's going to win the ACC. You can wager on that Florida State-Georgia Tech game in Ireland. FSU about a 13-point favorite in that game. There's so much action to be had at FanDuel. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sports book. FanDuel, the official sports book of the Locked On Network. Thank you so much for making Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. Make sure you're also checking out Locked On College Football. My guy Spencer McLaughlin must feel like it's Christmas Eve right now because we're about to get like the real thing is coming back this weekend. So make sure you check out Spencer hosting Locked On College Football. Takes you around all the big games, all the big storylines. Every now and then you'll see Kenton or myself as a guest on Locked On College Football. By the way, he's Kenton Gibbs from Locked On Wolfpack. I am Alex Donno from Locked On Canes. So Kenton, teams across the ACC are either less than a week or just less than 2 weeks away from playing their first game. What is standing out to you so far, the good and the bad? Because we did get some unfortunate injury news we'll get to this week. But what's been standing out to you in terms of fall camp reports?
Yeah, so particularly in the Triangle, I've heard a very mixed bag of things in terms of what's good, what's bad, what's ugly. But one thing that I think is very interesting, specifically out of the Tar Heels camp, is that the defensive line is being talked about in a very positive way. I mean, Bo Atkinson is being spoken about like, hey, he's coming along. He's going to be dominant this year. Josh Harris, a defensive tackle that spent 4 years at NC State, that then transferred to Ole Miss and is now back in the ACC. And in that NC State-UNC rivalry, just on the other side of it, is said to be a very poised leader who can help UNC in an area which they really struggled with to end off last year, stopping the run. Y'all know how I feel about the need to stop the run. And Josh Harris is a wide body that can absolutely help you get that done. And allegedly, he's being not just a leader by play, but also by word to kind of lead that defensive line in the way that they should be going. So ultimately, I look at that to say that could spell trouble for the rest of the ACC. Donno and I both talked about the worries about Max Johnson. We both believe that Hampton is one of the best backs in the nation. But one thing that Donno and I have not talked about that we know we're worried about with UNC, if you're a soft program where people call you a soft program, defensively is where that's going to start. And that's the concern for them. But if you can have a defensive line where it is not just a one-man effort in terms of, hey, we're trusting in Fox, we trust everybody else, just be out there. Just be out there. We don't have nobody besides Power Echols. Just be out there. Everybody else, figure it out. If you have a defensive unit that up front is sturdy, that works to calm a lot of those soft allegations or at least help you somewhat mitigate them. So that's something that's going on there. Obviously, NC State camp, everybody's excited about all of the pass catches and whatnot, but Justin Jolie is standing out. People are saying that not only is he hard to guard, he is extremely hard to bring down after he gets the ball in his hands. So a lot of the ACC should be looking out for that. A lot of folks should be, I'm not saying nervous and shaking in their boots, but I'd be surprised if I heard that their boots weren't quivering a little bit in terms of that rolling. And we got my man Manny Diaz, who is familiar with the ACC. I'm sure Donno's familiar with them. And one thing that's coming out of Duke's fall camp is that there is a level of competitiveness. There is a level of, hey, there's a chip on those guys' shoulders because they're believing they're not getting the respect that they should get. And, of course, the leaders are the ones starting that off. Of course, you got Jordan Moore and Chandler Rivers as guys who are returning. They're guys who are thought of highly around that program and all that. But those are guys that ultimately are going to have to be tone setters for this team. They cannot be thermometer guys that are like, hey, this is where we are. They got to be thermostat guys that change the temperature. And all reports from Duke camp are that they are that.
Nice. I love to hear that. Some of the things that have been standing out for Miami as they're, under 2 weeks away from opening up their season against Florida. We talk a lot, Kenton, about the defensive backfield being inexperienced, looking for more playmakers to emerge. Like the experienced guys they have, or Daryl Porter is a fifth-year senior at corner who had a really good year last year. Mish Powell is a former Washington Huskies safety who transferred in with a lot of experience, including playing in the national championship game last year, but a lot of youth other than that. And someone who's become a recent story at Hurricanes training camp has been young safety Markeith Williams. He had been the James Williams understudy for the last couple of years. James is now in the NFL, now playing linebacker for the Tennessee Titans, but was someone who started for 3 years at the U. And Markeith Williams has led Miami in practice interceptions so far. He's really been standing out. And I've also been pretty impressed with Jaden Harris, who was the understudy for Cam Kinchins for the last couple of years. So if the two of those guys can step up and fill some big shoes, Miami's secondary is going to be in a lot better shape. And on offense, Cam Ward has a lot of weapons to throw the football to. And, someone I'm thinking is really going to emerge for the Hurricanes this year is tight end number 8, Elijah Arroyo. This is a guy who, if he had any luck the last couple of years, it's only been bad luck when it comes to the injuries, recovering from ACL and a setback that has basically cost him his past 2 seasons. He's as healthy as he's been since he first arrived at Miami 3 years ago. He's put on a lot of lean muscle. He's moving very well in practice, and he's a guy who makes plays every single day. So look for guys like that to step up. And, we'll talk more about that Miami versus Florida game that's going to be coming up, because that's one of those spotlight games the first week of the year. And then elsewhere, Kenton, Florida State Seminoles have put out a depth chart heading into that game against Georgia Tech in Ireland. And you got to feel good. At least Mike Norvell certainly feels good, and rightfully so, about Florida State's offensive line depth. Mike Norvell listed 12 players on the 2 deep for so you have some oars in there, because obviously a 2 deep, 12 players, that the math doesn't check out. He's got a couple of oars, but he feels good about his offensive line depth. And then there's a couple of surprises. I know there have been concerns about Florida State's wide receiver core. Jaylen Brown, who I think is now a second-year guy, is listed as one of the starting wide receivers, which has surprised some people. Hakeem Williams isn't even on the depth chart, but he's been recovering from an illness, so that might just be more of a getting back into the swing of things sort of an issue. But it's going to be interesting, Kenton, to see how the Florida State Week 1 depth chart translates to the Game 1 depth chart when we actually see who takes the field in Dublin this weekend.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, as long as Tofili gets off the bus, as long as that offensive line gets off the bus, and by the way, we talk about Tofili a lot, but that entire backfield has been making noise at camp. I have not heard anything other than they have been a 2-3-headed monster that has been absolutely outstanding. And so, you're always hearing, he's in the best shape of his life, and this is, they're going to look great, they're going to look good. But would anybody be shocked? Would anybody be surprised if we actually see a situation like they had before with Benson, Tofili, and Ward, where you see multiple guys be game breakers for this team? If you saw Tofili and Lucas and Waddell be impact players, would anybody be surprised by that? I would say not really. And so with that in mind, I'm, again, the group that I'm concerned about, as long as they get off the bus, as long as they wake up and they're feeling halfway decent that day, I'd be surprised if those 3 didn't have their way with Georgia Tech's defense, which in the middle, they're not exactly the toughest in the world.
You said it. Styles make fights, and there's a lot of things that we both like about Georgia Tech heading into the season, but just with the way that matchup goes, Florida State's rushing offense against Georgia Tech's rushing defense, and to even call that a rushing defense may be too complimentary, because they didn't do any of that they didn't defend any rushes last year.
They were a rushing escort last year. They were a rushing detail to kind of guide running backs into the end zone. This way, young man, this way, follow us.
It was an easy pass lane, or a sun pass lane is what we call it down here in Florida. That's what it was last year. Oh man, now I feel like there are some exciting games this season involving ACC teams, both in conference and out of conference. So I was really interested to see this list. And this list is based on data. This was put together by Pete Nakos of On3. And it's not just Pete deciding, hey, these are the 10 games I'm most interested to watch. No, he combines TV ratings data to put this prediction algorithm together on what are going to be the 10 most watched games in college football this year. I think the one game on the list involving an ACC team may surprise you a little bit. That's the only one on the list. So you guys want to keep it locked right here. We're not done yet. Kenton Gibbs from Locked On Wolfpack. I am Alex Donno from Locked On Canes, right here on this brand new episode of Locked On ACC. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thank you so much for making Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. For your next listen, make sure you check out the other shows that Kenton and I host. He does an awesome job with Locked On Wolfpack. I host Locked On Canes. We're so much closer to actual college football being back. In the meantime, we've had a lot of fun talking about all the storylines and all the great stuff going on throughout the summer. But football is almost here. And, you know, Kenton, I'm going to start getting my viewing plans ready for this season. And according to Pete Nakos at On3, who says, looking at last year's TV data and this year's packed schedule, I did my best at predicting what the 10 most watched games of the college football season will be. He says, note that Texas, Oklahoma, and USC, LSU are neutral site games, just so people don't, you know, they understand that it's not someone at someone else's stadium. So number one on his list, Michigan at Ohio State. Yeah. Texas against Oklahoma. That's number 6. Number 2 is Georgia against Alabama. Number 3 is Texas against Michigan. You're going to see Texas on this list a lot. Number 4, Ohio State at Oregon. Number 5, Notre Dame against Texas A&M. Number 6, Texas against Oklahoma. Number 7, Texas against Texas A&M. They're SEC rivals now. Number 8, USC against LSU. Number 9, Miami at Florida. Number 10, Colorado at Nebraska. So first thing that stands out there is, Kenton, you only have one of those, according to Pete Nakos' prediction, only one of those top 10 most watched games involves an ACC team. And I'm not taking anything away from it. I'll be there. Miami at Florida is the only game that cracked that list. Interesting to think about that, Kenton, when you've got Florida State playing Notre Dame on the road this year. That seems like a really big game. Yeah, I'll throw some love to your NC State Wolfpack, who take on Tennessee this year. That's a big game. Like, Florida State plays Florida this year. Florida State and Clemson play each other this year. I'm surprised that only one game involving an ACC team made that list.
Well, this list tells me one thing. It's one of those money ball situations where you go full money ball, where you go full analytics and say it's because he gets on base and don't pay attention to anything else. These matchups on paper are supposed to be great matchups. However, many people have talked about Michigan and how good or bad they'll be this season.
Yeah.
If Michigan isn't a top 15-ish team this year, why would the game be the most watched game in all of college football?
And do we even know, like, is Michigan going to be allowed to be in the playoff this year? Do we even know that yet?
I have no clue. But here's the thing. Even if I were to tell you, hey, I believe in this team and they'll be amazing, or even if I was to tell you anything short of I believe in this team and they'll be amazing regardless, you talk about what the viewership of that game was when Ohio State was dominating, right? The Brady Hoke era and all that at Michigan. That game wasn't the highest watched game any year because everybody knew you don't make it a highest watched game to watch one team get dominated. Now, Texas, Michigan, I think that's absolutely correct because at that time, you're going to be asking yourself, who are these teams? Georgia and Alabama, another situation where regardless of what those teams are, that's going to be one that's going to be highly rated. But again, a lot of these are just like, I'm not sure. Some of these aren't early enough in the season for you to say this is going to matter, because if one or both of these teams are not good, I do not care how big your market is.
Right.
It will not be worth watching.
Right.
If Venables doesn't get it together down there at Oklahoma, why would anybody want to watch the Red River Shootout? Why? Why? Like, you know,
I don't know. I think that's one of those you just always watch. I don't know. I agree with almost everything you said, but you lost me at the Red River one.
I hear you. But if we're not talking about just like pure ball lovers like you and me, to make it to the top of this list, you got to have the casuals invested. You got to have the bettors invested. You got to have everybody, all hands on deck. Now, hear me out. If that game, oh yeah, Venables ain't got it, they're about to get destroyed, are you sure that's going to be top 10 most watched this year? I'm not sure about that. You could sell me on it. If we bring back the live show, maybe during Sell Me Why, we'll talk about it. I'm not sure if that's the 6th most watched game of the year.
Now, what about Colorado, Nebraska? Like Nebraska, I think it's going to be considerably better this year. I don't know. Colorado, I have no idea. But it's just a Deion Sanders thing, right? Is there any other reason why that would be and I'm not saying it isn't. I understand it because I saw the ratings. Like Colorado was putting up blockbuster numbers en route to 4-8 last year. Like they were putting up great TV. Everybody was watching them play last year. So that's just one of those Coach Prime things, right?
Absolutely. Well, not only is it the Coach Prime thing, Nebraska is allegedly back. They've got a quarterback that's allegedly Mahomey, if you know what that means. Yeah. And so with that being said, that game is week 2 of the season. I'm sure Deion Sanders had me. I remember exactly where I was watching Colorado State, Colorado last year. I remember exactly where I was. So that game being week 2, it's a lot like the Michigan and Texas game where you're trying to figure out who are both of these teams. And of course, Deion Sanders, because of who he is always going to draw a hate watch. It's a lot like, I can't remember what radio personality it was. I believe it was Howard Stern that said, I figured out the people who hated me watched me listened to me almost 2 times more than the people who loved me. Deion Sanders may thrive off that. He may be, and Matt Rule, and quiet is kept. The guy on the other side has a similar situation. As somebody who lives in North Carolina, I know for a fact there are people who are going to hate watch Matt Rule and hope that he fails and crashes and burns in everything he does. So I'm excited to see how this thing works itself out.
Yeah, me too. And listen, I hope that there's more games involving ACC teams. Yeah, I'm happy to see, because Miami at Florida, that's going to be a super interesting game because it can go a number of different directions, Kenton. Like you're either watching it for the potential train wreck of what would the Billy Napier narrative or the Mario Cristobal narrative be for whoever loses that game. You might be watching it for the train wreck, or you might simply be watching it because, it's one of these unique situations. This happens in the state of Florida with Miami and UF, where even though they're historic rivals within the same state, they don't play each other every year. They used to up until 1987, but it's not been a regular rivalry. So it feels a little special where, Florida plays Florida State every year. Florida State plays Miami every year. Miami versus Florida is a once in a blue moon thing. So there's a lot of intrigue for that game, but I still feel like there's a lot of other ACC games that maybe could have stuck into this list and didn't.
You're absolutely right. And again, if we're talking about projections based on, hey, we just believe that these teams will all be good, this list does make a lot of sense. But again, when you account for the fact that at some point in time, at least a couple of these teams are going to do the human thing where you're just like, my God, USC is so terrible this year. Who could have seen this coming? My God, Texas A&M looks so bad. Watching them play is like a punishment. And I would say it's something that we should allow the court systems in the U.S. to do, but we have outlawed cruel and unusual punishment. It's one of those things. We believe that Elko will carry the success that he had at Duke over to Texas A&M with better players. But if he doesn't, then what? if there is that division of the locker room where it's like, oh, I don't want to buy into the system or whatever the case may be, then what are we looking at? So objectively speaking, I wouldn't be surprised to see that list look extremely different at the end of it. And a quick correction, because I know I was talking about the defensive tackle from Clemson, whose name I could not think of earlier. Peyton Page is the name. Peyton Page is the guy. He's their starting nose guard. He is a heck of a player. He has slimmed down a ton, and he's looking good and primed and ready to go by all accounts out of camp. So I'm excited to see what the season has for him.
Well, we'll turn the page on this episode of Locked On ACC, and we will talk to you again tomorrow. He is Kenton Gibbs from Locked On Wolfpack. I am Alex Donno from Locked On Canes, and we'll talk to you again next time on another episode of Locked On ACC, part of the awesome Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.